Hey everyone, I'm Mohan, your TA, and I'll be talking about motor learning today from a higher order cognition level. So this will be relatively light on the neuroscience part, but we'll touch on some brain areas where it's appropriate. If you don't know what I study or had me as a TA before, going to be a fifth year in the psychology department, and I work with Dr. Timothy Rickard, and I investigate what are the best ways to learn, why are those the best ways, and then can I build computational or mathematical models to predict what people will learn. I am now a cognitive psychologist, but several years ago, I used to be a cognitive neuroscientist, so much so that I even printed my brain, 3D printed it, and I also have my brain tattooed on myself. I used to be very deep into it, but then I saw the light. No, cognitive psychology was just a better tool for the questions I was interested in, which is higher order cognition. And we'll kind of see why a little bit in this lecture. Some of these tasks are or processes are hard to pin down in the brain. We don't know too much. All right, so in this lecture, I'll just cover these following topics. So the stages of motor learning, the different brain areas that are involved, and then also the multiple learning processes that make up motor learning. And then we'll also talk about some of my research, because that's the exciting part about going to UCSD. You get to learn about some of the research that's on the bleeding edge, like, when does motor learning occur? It's probably not a question you've thought about, but it's probably influenced some of your life, actually. And you've probably heard of some of the claims that some other researchers have made that I will hopefully try and convince you that they were wrong for good reasons. Anyways, so we can break down motor learning into three main components. The goal selection part, let me get my little laser pointer. So we have the goal selection part here, and then we have the action selection, and then action execution. So let's take the example of learning to hit the brake when you see a red light while driving. So at some point you learn this, whenever, that when you see a red light, the car needs to stop. And in order to achieve that, you need to press the brake pedal, and then you must execute the pressing of the brake pedal with your foot. And there's a degree of smoothness that you can learn over time with this execution. So new drivers are usually maybe not as smooth with this, and over time it becomes very automatic. And essentially all motor learning can be conceptualized with these three stages. Learning can happen at each stage, and learning at any stage can be considered motor learning. But, different motor learning tasks stress improvements at different stages. So, for example, what I study, sequence learning, in this dark blue, learning mostly occurs in the goal selection stage and the action selection stage. Conversely, tasks that focus learning at the level of action execution, like motor acuity paradigms, typically do not involve any learning at all at the level of goal selection or action selection. And the reason I show this little figure here is because we can use these different tasks to study different parts of the time course of motor learning. So it kind of helps us kind of tease apart what's going on at each of these stages. And so where does motor learning, skill learning fall within this graph of different types of memories or learning in memories? And so hopefully you've seen this diagram before, and it just shows the breakdown of the different types of memories. And so motor memories are part of implicit the memory system, and then this can further be conceptualized into procedural memory, which is grouped with cognitive skills like math, which is kind of weird. I don't know if you ever thought that was really weird to conceptualize or to group math and motor learning together. But when you think about it, they're actually kind of similar problems if you think about it very abstractly. So these two types of learning, motor learning and like solving math problems, can be solved in similar ways. So if you're presented with a stimulus, like an equation, you need to figure out what you need to solve for. So you need to know what the goal is. So if you're solving for X, you need to know that you have to solve for X. And then you need to figure out which actions you need to take. So you need to get X by itself. That's the goal. And to do that, you have to maybe subtract something, maybe divide something. And so that's how you'll solve it. Those are the action selections. And so in a very big picture way, they're actually similar problems. So that's kind of why they're grouped together in this graph. All right, so brain areas. So as you can see, there's a large part of the cortex and an entire cerebellum down here and down here as well that is dedicated to motor learning and movements. It's obvious that this is pretty complex. And in fact, I hope you can appreciate the computations that go into things that we consider basic, like going up the stairs or typing. There's a slew of vectors that we need to calculate, that our brain just does automatically. Like, I'm not very good at calculus, but or physics at all, but my brain can just do it automatically, unconsciously. And it also is able to know the appropriate muscles that need to be activated and also inhibited too, because you don't want to be extending your leg at the wrong time while going up the stairs, because it might cause you to fall over and then you'll be in the hospital, which isn't good. And, even until recently, we haven't been able to get humanoid robots to climb upstairs like humans, just because it's such a difficult task to solve, even with the most advanced deep learning methods. And so I'm going to briefly cover the little bit of what we know about some of these areas and how they contribute to motor sequence learning, because that's what I study. And I think we're also touching on some general motor functions and the relation to brain areas in a different lecture. So I'm just going to kind of touch lightly on those areas. So we'll first start with the cerebellum. And as you have learned, or hopefully will learn, that the cerebellum is very important for motor prediction, error correction, and execution of motor movements themselves. However, this is mostly in the context of like motor adaptation, like reaching and picking up a cup of coffee. Maybe it's a little windy, maybe you don't know the amount of liquid that's in there. And so you can adjust the force that you need to do to pick that cup up smoothly. And so that's your cerebellum at work there. What we do know in motor sequence learning and with the cerebellum, its role is that patients with bilateral cerebellar lesions, so cuts back there, do not exhibit improvements in reaction times for sequences versus performing an individual element, whereas healthy controls do. So, for example, if someone's learning a sequence that's 4-1-3-2-4, eventually you would get better at that sequence as long as you're a neurotypical adult. But if you have bilateral lesions there, you actually don't get better at that sequence any more so than just performing a single element. And so it's still an open question of whether the cerebellum contributes to the learning of the sequence or rather just the execution of them. We haven't been able to tease that out. And further, it's unclear how this relates to other processes that we know that the cerebellum is involved in, like sensory prediction errors. It's kind of unclear, as it's going to be the theme of most of these brain areas and how it relates to motor sequence learning. So the basal ganglia is a little less muddy in its role in motor sequence learning. We know that increased bold activity in the putamen is correlated with increased performance of well-learned sequences. In other parts of the basal ganglia, these are correlated with earlier learning of the sequence. And so we know in monkey studies, injections that deactivate the putamen causes an increase in the number of errors made during well-learned sequences. So if you've already robustly learned 4-1-3-2-4-5 or 4-1-3-2-4, then if you have this injection there in the putamen, you're going to make more errors. Whereas if you deactivate the anterior caudae in monkeys with an injection, this reduces their ability to actually learn the sequence. So it seems like there's multiple roles that the basal ganglia plays in the learning of a sequence and also kind of once the sequence has been learned. Even with this said, we're still not entirely exactly sure how it contributes to motor sequence learning overall. We just know that it supports the learning of it and then also supports the expression of a learned sequence. So one popular hypothesis is that the basal ganglia contributes to the organization of individual elements into a sequence and helps drive automaticity, which I'm not really going to touch on this concept, but all it is like once you've learned something really well, like pressing the brake when you see a red light, these actions are automatic. Yeah. And so also anterior regions of the putamen have been found to be active during the planning period before the first element of a sequence is initiated. So, the basal ganglia, it's been implicated in gating some of these actions. So maybe it actually also might control the outflow of an action sequence that is determined elsewhere rather than actually storing or driving the execution of the entire sequence. So it seems to be multifaceted, but in motor sequence learning and its role of learning these sequences, but it's not fully clear exactly what it's doing. Like in declarative learning, the hippocampus becomes less active as the memory becomes more consolidated. Thus, the more stable the memory and the more integrated it is into long-term memory, the less hippocampal activation. And so we believe that the hippocampus is imperative for developing sequence fragments. For example, if we have 4-1-3-2-4, the hippocampus would break that sequence up into smaller chunks, maybe like 4-1-3-2-4, which is actually what we see in the data, which is kind of cool. Finally, there's also some evidence that the activity in the hippocampus actually increases very early in learning. And again, this suggests the importance of associating small numbers of sequence elements together explicitly, Thus, the hippocampus appears to contribute to sequence learning by supporting the acquisition of fragmentary sequential orders, which then can be chunked and consolidated into higher order sequence representations. The supplementary motor area is active during the planning period before the execution of a sequence. So, for example, we know this if we apply a TMEMS over the SMA. This interferes with one's ability to perform complex sequential key presses. And so single cell recordings also suggest that neurons respond to a particular action that are sequence specific. So on a finer brain scale, so if we're recording someone from some neurons in the SMA while they're typing 41324, the SMA appears to encode the preparation of the next movement to be executed. Since activity reflecting, for example, like the second action, so it'd be the 1 in the 41324 sequence, gradually increases from the start of the sequence until the point when the second element is to be executed. So all this suggests is that the SMA is really important for planning out your next sequence, or the next item in the sequence, or the next chunk of that sequence each time, and that there's specific neurons that code for this as well. And so we're gonna, this one's a little aside, and you're not gonna be quizzed on this, but I just kind of want to do this for intellectual purposes, because we're all very familiar with patient HM. And so we know that, they had their bilateral hippocampus lesioned and cut out. So normal brain, HM's brain. And classically, we're taught that HM can learn no declarative tasks, and they can learn implicit tasks, right? He can learn implicit tasks. So for example, this mirror drawing task, he's able to learn. So, as we saw earlier, the picture with the brain, all the areas involved in motor learning, it's a very complex phenomena that involves many regions. And so that means, what that implies is that motor learning doesn't exist in a silo. So what do I mean by that? So actually, until like the past decade and a half, classically, motor learning has been taught to be orthogonal to other types of learning, or at least suggested, maybe not taught, but like declarative learning, and that it's only an implicit process. So we can actually re-examine patient HM. So like you learned in this class, and pretty much every other psychology class and student has, you're taught that HM can't do declarative tasks, but can only learn implicit tasks. So however, let's think about this a little deeper, about that mirror tracing task that HM did. So the critical finding that was shown is that HM showed improvement in this mirror tracing task over 3 days. And each day, he had no recollection that he's done this task, or even a sense of familiarity with it, that he, has encountered this before. So what this does show is that, across each days, HM does not need declarative memory to show that he is learning the task, because he's clearly getting better, even though he has no conscious recollection of doing it. However, it does leave open the possibility that HM used declarative processes within each session to perform the mirror tracing task. So what do I mean by that? So for example, on this first day, he's not doing very well at the task, but he clearly had to understand what the instructions were initially, and then use that to kind of guide his learning. And so demonstrably, understanding instructions is a very explicit task and a very declarative task, right? So he had to have been using declarative resources and some declarative processes to actually do this task. And so more recent work has reinforced this idea, showing that the combination of instruction and implicit learning is necessary for amnesic patients like HM to learn novel tools. And you can also argue that this task isn't actually de novo or novel. It's just changing some vectors. It's just mirroring your vectors that you already know how to move your hand in. One can make the argument. Anyways, what I'm really just trying to hit home in this lecture... Oh, sorry, my throat is dying. Anyways, what I really hope to hit home in this lecture is that our learning systems are highly interactive, and they work in tandem to develop these complex motor skills. And so let's further examine this idea that there's two underlying systems in motor learning. One thing that we can examine we can use to understand motor learning is computational models. And computational models are simply mathematical models that make predictions given a system, and it makes predictions under different conditions about different behavior. So for example, we can use this to kind of tease apart two different learning rates. And so we can do this in motor adaptation experiments. So in Smith et al. 2006, they compared 3 models, we're just going to focus on 2, that explain several motor learning phenomena that previous models had trouble explaining in conjunction. So there's savings, anterograde interference, rapid adaptation, and rapid downscaling. Savings refers to the residual learning after previous learning has been washed out. Anterograde interference refers to the initial learning interfering with subsequent learning of the opposite motor adaptation. Rapid adaptation and downscaling refer to the unlearning of motor adaptation. And this learning is faster than the initial learning of the adaptation. They explored this phenomena in a motor adaptation paradigm. So for this paradigm, participants controlled a two-joint machine that controlled a cursor. The participants' goal was to reach for a circular target using their hand that controlled the cursor. The initial trials were null trials. Look at my laser pointer again. These null trials, which were just them, there's no adaptation, there's no force being applied to the little controller or the cursor, so they're just getting familiar with the task. And there's the adaptation trials where there's a force applied to it, and so they adapt to it. And there's the de-adaptation trials where the opposite force is applied, and this is to wash out learning. And then the air clamp trials where the machine just automatically goes to the target that they're supposed to reach. And any adaptation left over is called savings, and so this is leftover learning. So to explain these findings, they compared 3 models. We're only talking about 2, just to keep things a little simpler. And one model assumed one learning rate, which we'll call the single state model, and another model assumed 2 learning rates from 2 different processes. And they called these the fast and slow processes because one learning rate was fast and the other was slow. On the y-axis here, we have the amount of adaptation. On the x-axis, we have the trial number. So remember, these trials, they're just getting used to the task, and so they do a good job of doing that. And there's no force applied. And then these gray trials, this is when the force is applied and they quickly adapt. So these blue lines is the data. So you can see they're doing a pretty good job of adapting to the force. And then this is the washout trials. And so the opposite force is applied. The data isn't shown here, but just know that it happened. And then here's the air clamp trials where the machine will just automatically go to the target. And even still, they're kind of doing a little bit of adjustment, even though they don't actually need to do anything. And so this is considered leftover learning. Savings. Right, so the red line is the single state model, so it does a pretty good job of capturing the data over here during the adaptation trials, but it looks like it completely fails at capturing the data here. Whereas the green line, which is the multi-state or multi-rate model, it does a much better job of capturing it during the adaptation trials, and is also very good at capturing it during the de-adaptation trials as well. Sorry, not the de-adaptation, the air clamp trials. And so why is it actually able to do that? So it's because that it has 2 learning rates. So there's the fast one and the slow one. So the fast learning rate has a fast learning rate, fast decay, whereas the slow learning rate has a slow learning rate and a slow decay. So even though this washes out most of this air clamp trial, so even though this de-adaptation trials wash out most of the learning, it's only washing out the fast state. And the slow learning state, because it's a slow learner, it's not going to be affected by this as much. And so that's why this leftover slow state is able to capture the data. So essentially, I'm just trying to say is that the slow state hasn't decayed from previous learning, and it also hasn't been affected as much by this de-adaptation trials. And so this leftover, or the savings, that's reflected in the data and in the model. And originally, the authors suggested that these 2 processes mapped on the cerebellar processes. However, an alternate explanation, like almost a decade later, comes from McDougall et al. When he was at Princeton. And they suggested that these fast and slow processes are actually analogous to explicit and implicit processes. So to test this, they use a visual motor rotation task that was analogous to the adaptation task that Smith et al. Used. In one of the conditions, they had participants explicitly report their heading angle. So their explicit aim might be at 2, but then when they actually do it, it's at like 5. And so the difference between these 2 is the amount of implicit learning that has occurred. And so they use that 2-state gain model, multi-rate learning model from Smith et al. And so it did a good job of fitting both to the explicit and implicit components of learning during the first adaptation. So here we have in purple the heading angle. So that's the raw data. And then the model output for the total output is this green line here. So it does a pretty good job of capturing that. And in blue, we have the explicit learning. So this is what the participants reported. And then the fast process pretty much maps onto that almost identically. And then we have the implicit learning, which is also data that's there. And that's the slow process that almost maps onto that perfectly as well. And then we have the de-adaptation. And we come back and have these savings. And this is where it just goes automatically to the target. So here it's under predicting the angle a little bit. And, so what this implies with this under prediction is that there's actually another process that the slow process is actually made up of two processes. And so you probably need another parameter to actually be able to capture it as well. To some of these findings, there are multiple processes that have different learning rates and probably reflect multiple learning systems that lead to motor learning. And we're now just appreciating the magical synergy between these systems. And until recently, it was largely thought of a unitary process. And hopefully I've convinced you as well is that these two systems are very interactive for motor skill learning. Now we're going to dive into motor sequence learning, or rather, when does motor learning happen in the context of motor sequence learning, and which is what I study. So I'm very excited about this. And I love it so much, I actually made a company to teach people the piano called MIDI Scale, based on optimal learning and memory principles. The goal is to create an artificial tutor one day, which I just submitted a grant for, so hopefully I get funded in 6 months. And if you're interested, you can check out the QR code or go to midiscale.com, which would be cool. All right, so this has become one of my favorite quotes. Most, if not all, motor learning occurs offline. And because I don't have to straw man the oppositional view. Obviously, I take a different view, and hopefully I can convince you of my view in this short time that we have. So it's a radical claim that all motor learning occurs offline, and if this were true, this would be in stark contrast to everything we know about declarative learning. So this is, no one's claiming in declarative learning that you're learning more when you're not doing a task, right? If you learn someone's name, I immediately forget it. You're not going to remember more of their name later. It just doesn't happen. That's not how declarative learning works. And so this would be quite different. And this would suggest that the memory system in motor learning is quite different than declarative learning. Yeah, so I don't know any cases where offline learning occurs for declarative learning. Actually, funny story about this. So I was working with Dr. Celeste Pillegard and writing a book chapter about long-term memory. She sent me a chapter from one of the most used psychology textbooks in college classrooms on long-term memory, and they frame how sleep affects declarative learning by saying that it enhances learning, when in fact it's merely describing memory stabilization. So this, in my view, in my humble opinion, is problematic because it's leading researchers to write textbooks that are teaching you, students, psychology students, a gross mischaracterization of what's actually occurring. So memory strengths aren't increasing while you sleep. You're just kind of stabilizing these memories through consolidation. There's no evidence that that's occurring in declarative learning. And we'll talk about this debate and motor learning as well. What do I mean when I say offline learning? So what it means is when you're resting or just doing nothing, like you're sleeping or taking a break after learning a skill, or you increase your performance or learning in that skill. So for example, if we're doing a task where your goal, maybe you've done this task in one of my SONA studies, probably, where you're typing 41324 with your non-dominant left hand over and over again. And as you continuously do this, you get better at it. So your reaction time decreases for completing the sequence. And so this is called online learning. But let's say, you do this training and then you go to sleep and you come back the next day and all of a sudden you're better. So this would be called offline learning. So you're not doing anything and all of a sudden you're better at this task because assumably you've learned more. And so there's been this claim of offline learning occurring at 3 different time scales. So the first was during sleep by Matthew Walker, I think was his name, something Walker. He's at Berkeley. And so this is about an 8-hour time scale. And the second one was 5 to 30 minutes. And then most recently has been 10 seconds. So they're getting smaller and smaller time scales. And they keep making this claim that offline learning is occurring. And my lab and me have been knocking down each one slowly but surely. Yeah, we've definitely proved this one wrong. And most recently have proved this one wrong. And then, or at least provided evidence against it. And then hopefully we'll be able to provide strong evidence against this one as well. And sometimes you might hear me say this word consolidation on these slides because that's the proposed mechanism of offline learning. And consolidation is just thought to be caused by hippocampal to neocortical replay of memories, which helps to integrate them into long-term memory. And so we know that I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not arguing against that consolidation is happening. I'm not arguing against that phenomena. It's just whether or not does this consolidation cause more learning. We know it causes stabilization, of course, but the debate is, does it cause more learning? And, there is a very good reason why researchers think that there's offline learning occurring. So here's one example. in this graph. So on the y-axis is the correct sequence speed, so higher is better. And on the x-axis is the trial number. So we can define online learning here. So this is one trial right here. So it's the difference between the start of the trial and the end of the trial. And then we can define offline learning as the difference of trial n and the end of trial n to the beginning of trial n plus 1. And so we can average these out on this violin graph here. So we look at online learning, it's quite flat. There's no increase over time on the sequence speed. Whereas offline learning, it looks as like essentially all the learning is occurring offline in between trials. And, and so this looks quite compelling. And, when the data is modeled like this, it looks obvious that learning occurs offline and that there's no online learning occurring. And I would like to say I can also replicate these findings with my own data. When I model it like this, I get the same results, even when I do slightly different data analysis methods. It's pretty robust, right? You guys convinced that offline learning is occurring? I almost was. But anyway, just to really hit home what the offline learning people are claiming, I made this graph to illustrate it. So here it's slightly different. So here we're modeling or showing reaction time. So in this case, lower is better as you get better at the test. So lower reaction time implies more learning. And so what essentially they're saying is at each trial it's flat, and then learning occurs between the trials, it's flat, learning occurs between the trials, it's flat, et cetera, et cetera. And this is due to consolidation. However, we're not actually directly measuring learning, we're measuring performance, aka reaction time. And performance is involved with a lot of factors. For example, one could be tired, or maybe you choke during your performance when you're trying to throw a baseball. I mean, maybe you guys have had this experience during exams where you know the information, but for some reason it's just not, it's not getting out there. It's not getting in your brain. You just learn this and it's in there if you get the right cues, but for some reason it's not happening. Doesn't mean you don't know the information. It's just something about performance is not reflecting of what you actually know. Essentially, what I'm trying to say here is that there could be a third variable problem that could be explaining why it looks like there's no learning occurring during the trial or online learning, but there's learning occurring between trials, aka offline learning. So enter reactive inhibition, or RI, as I'll say. So RI is just the worsening of performance as on-task trial time increases. And this looks like this blue line here. So within the trial, you get worse as you continue the task, but then between the trial, reactive inhibition dissipates, and then you get better at the beginning of the trial, and then it comes back, and same thing over and over again. So it goes up during the trial, and then down between trials. So in this study I'm talking about, we were interested in the post-rest gain phenomena. So there'd be like a small break here, and then or like a 5-minute break, and then it'd come back, all of a sudden they would be better. And so there's two explanations of why this was occurring. It was either due to consolidation or due to the release of reactive inhibition. But the logic of the explanation kind of the data is not the most intuitive. So I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to sufficiently explain it in the time that I have. So I'm just going to leave it out. If you're interested in more of this stuff, you can feel free to check out some of my papers on my Google Scholar, or just stop by in office hours anytime, or just email me. Happy to talk about it. Right. So we know that two things affect reactive inhibition. There's the trial time, which causes more reactive inhibition. So the more sequences you complete, the more reactive inhibition you'll have. And then the break time, the longer your breaks, the more it will dissipate. So it stands to reason. If we change these two variables, it should affect the amount of reactive inhibition. So if we increase the trial time, this will increase the reactive inhibition during the trial. And if we increase the break time, this will dissipate more of it. So of course, I love my computational models. So I made one where we have two learning rates, surprise, surprise. And then there's some parameters that reflect reactive inhibition, building up within trials and across trials. And so the goal of this model was to appropriately capture learning, and then also explain the variance in the data, just like in the previous study. And then further, this model assumes online learning and no offline learning, which is contrary to the other claims of this other kind of viewpoint. And so if it's able to capture the data, this would suggest that online learning and assuming reactive inhibition is a sufficient model, whereas possibly this consolidation offline learning model is not. And just an aside, if you ever have the chance to take a computational modeling class, I took a neurocomputational modeling class in college, and it was probably, even though I don't do neuroscience anymore, it was definitely one of the more influential classes on what I do research now. Kind of showed me the light of learning about computational models and why they're so useful. And if you're interested in talking about it, computational models in general, they're very cool. I'm happy to talk about this as well. Anyways, so to test this, I had 2 independent variables where we manipulated the number of sequences participants performed. So either 5 sequences per trial, and then we also had a mass group that performs 15 sequences per trial. So a low reactive inhibition group, high reactive inhibition group. And then we also manipulated their break time, where they either had 10 or 30-second breaks. And then during the practice, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't say what they were doing. So they're just typing the sequence over and over again, 4, 1, 3, 2, 4, with their non-dominant left hand. And they do this for 180 sequences, and then they have a 5-minute rest, and they perform 30 more. And so maybe some of you guys have done this task, because I ran quite a few participants on this. So maybe it was one of you. Anyways, so these graphs show the model fit. So these graphs show the model fits for each group. On the y-axis, we have the reaction time for a correctly completed sequence in milliseconds. In the x-axis, we have the sequence number. So the blue dots are the completed sequence, and the red lines are the model fits. And the dots that are connected are the ones on the same trial. And this dashed gray line shows the underlying learning, reflecting only the learning rate part of the equation model. So overall, we see that the model does a pretty good job of predicting the data in several different conditions, regardless of the amount of sequences they performed, and regardless of the break time in each condition. So what this suggests is that reactive inhibition increases with more sequences during the trial, and more reactive inhibition decreases with longer break times, or dissipates, sorry. And then, we can assume online learning with 2 different learning rates and reactive inhibition is sufficient to explain the motor sequence learning, and that we don't have to assume that offline learning is occurring. It's not necessary. And so hopefully I've somewhat convinced you, or brought you to my side, that motor learning occurs when it happens is occurring online, and that only offline processes are just there to stabilize the memories. Okay. Thanks guys for listening, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me or come to my office hours. See ya.